This is a lesson for algebra for section 8-1, day 1. What we're talking about today are histograms and dot plots. So a dot plot is a good way for whole number data to be represented that has a limited range. All right. It's not a huge range where you have like 1 to 1,000. It's a very limited range. Just a way to organize your data so that you can see it a little bit better. When you go to do a dot plot, you're going to start with a number line that's long enough to include all the data points. What you're going to do is you are going to place an X or some other symbol. I would prefer if you did an X above the number line for each instance of a given data value. So these are really, really easy. Don't make them harder than what they are. In this case, they want you to do a dot plot of the amount of sugar in one serving of cereal. So somebody went through and they must have looked at a whole bunch of cereal boxes, and there was 13 grams of sugar, 7 grams of sugar, 4 grams of sugar, 5, and so on and so forth. So they looked at a whole bunch of boxes of cereal, and they want to better organize the data, see how much sugar is in cereal. So the first thing that you need to do is you need to set up your number line. You need to look for the highest number and the lowest number so you know what to do your number line by, where to start and where to end. When I take a look at these numbers, I can see that 1 is the lowest number, and I can see that 22 is the highest number. So I'm going to put 1 all the way down at this end of my number line at the beginning, and I'm going to put 22 down here. Now, sometimes you might have to count by 2s or by 5s or by something like that. But most of the time, you're just going to count by 1s. So I already have that done. You should always label what that is at the bottom as well. So I have 1 through 22 on my number line. Now, all that I need to do, this is not very difficult. Don't make it harder than it is. Just take a look at what you have and organize your data. So we have a 13. Since we have a 13, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put an X right above the 13. Then I have a 7. I'm going to put an X right above the 7. Now, when you make your X's, you want your X's to all be the same size because you're going to want to compare those and sort of see some trends in the data and things like that. And if you make one X really, really tall, really, really small, and one X really, really big, for example, if I made one X that was this big with the number 8, but then I had other ones that looked like this, they look like they're the same size, that they had the same number, but this is only 1 where this is 4. So you want to make your X's all the same size. The other suggestion that I have is, hopefully you notice what I was doing. I was crossing the numbers out as I use them. It's very easy in these to lose track of where you are. So I would suggest crossing them out as you go. So I'm going to keep on going with this. And then we have some questions to answer from the dot plot. So we have a 4, we have a 10, we have a 3. And again, you want to make all of your dots the same. I would not go through, now we're starting to see multiples of the same numbers here. I would not go through and try and do all the 7s all at once and then try and do all the 1s all at once and stuff like that. I would just go number by number. You're less likely to make a mistake if you do it the way that I am doing it here. So let me graph this number 11 here. And now we have our finished dot plot. That's all it is. You're just organizing your data. So when I take a look at this data, I can see that my lowest one is 1. My highest one is 22. There's a whole bunch right around this 4 to 7 range. And then there's sort of a little cluster here. But most of them are somewhere in between like that 4 and 11 range. That's where most of them are. My biggest number of any of them are 7. All right. 7 grams. There's 4 different cereals that have 7, but there's a whole bunch that have 0, some that have 1, and some that have 2. So now you're going to be asked some questions about them. How many cereals had 5 grams of sugar or less? So we're looking for 5 or less. Well, 5 or less would be everything that is here, 5 or less. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different cereals that had 5 or less. How many cereals had more than 10? Now, more than 10 does not, oops, sorry, I went the wrong way. More than 10 does not include 10. More than 10 would be 11 or higher. So we're looking at these ones, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different cereals. Now, if this said 10 or more, then we would have to include 10, but it just said more than 10. How many cereals had exactly 5 grams of sugar? Exactly 5 would be this number right here. Exactly 5 grams of sugar. There are 2 of them. So that's what a dot plot is. All right. It's sort of like an X plot. All right. I would prefer if you put X's, but technically you could put anything that you want above it. It's sort of like a bar graph, sort of. All right. But it's called a dot plot. The next type of item that we're talking about is a histogram. A histogram is very, very, very similar to a bar graph. All right. A histogram is very, very similar. So data is sorted into consistent equal intervals. Those intervals are called bins. These are all bins right here. All right. It's sort of like if you were if you had a whole bunch of miscellaneous things and maybe you grouped it by vegetable soup and chicken soup and beef soup, and you're sort of just tossing cans and sorting them out. That's really what we're doing here. All the numbers that are in between 1 and 5 go here. All the numbers that are in between 6 and 10 are going to go here, and so on and so forth. Bars are all colored the same, and touch. That is very important. On the Regents exam, they're very, very picky on that. Sometimes it looks like one solid piece. Ideally, there are 5 to 8 intervals. Now, normally you would have to set these up on your own, but sometimes they'll be set up for you. So we're using that same sugar in the cereal data that we used before for the dot plot. But here's what you're going to do. Now, tallies, what a tally is a way to keep track of how many there are. You have the one, the second time you have one, you put another tally mark. The third time you put another tally mark. The fourth time you put another tally mark. But then on the fifth one, you sort of group them together. So it's easy to group together in groups of 5, and that way you can count them up quickly. When we would have number 6, we would start with number 6 like this, then 7, then 8, then 9, and then we would make another cross one to be 10, so that you can just count up very easily and go, oh, 5 and 10. Don't go and do 10 of them like this, because it's a lot easier to make a mistake. We do it like this way. That way you can add them up quickly. You're more exact. So the first one is 13. Again, I would strongly suggest crossing them out as you go. So we're going to put one tally mark in the 13 area. 7, 4, 5, 11, 12, 7, 5, 10, 4, 10, 3. Notice that I'm putting my slash through it like that. 7, 4 again, 7, 1, 8, 22, 6, and 11. Now, also, I wanted to point out in the bins or the intervals, notice that it is the same number of numbers in there. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. We have 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So there's 5 numbers in each of these bins. All right. That has to be consistent throughout the course. So now what you're going to do is you're going to add up your tally marks and put the number in the frequency. Frequency is the actual number of each of those. So here we have 7 tally marks. So there's 7 cereals that are in between 1 and 5. There are 8 cereals in between 6 and 10. There are 4 of them here. Here we just have a 0, and here we have a 1. Now what we're going to do is we're going to make our histogram. We're going to make our bar graph. First of all, we need to figure out what goes on the bottom and what goes up the side. Well, your number of cereals is going to go up the side. This is your number of cereals is going to go up the side here. Our intervals are going to go down at the bottom. So here we're going to have 1 to 5. Now 1 to 5 is going to be in between. Use your graph to your advantage here. 1 to 5 is going to be in between those two little red lines. Then we're going to have 6 to 10. And sometimes it's hard to squeeze them in there. 11 to 15. In between there and there. And then 16 to 20. And then we have 21 to 25. And again, sometimes it's a little bit hard to squeeze those numbers in. We want to label what those are. All right. This is the amount of sugar. All right. This is the amount of sugar in one serving. And every graph has to have a title as well. Let's just call this sugar in cereals. So now we're ready to make our bar graph. All right. When we go to make our bar graph, again, each bar is the same color. All right. Don't use different colors. And the bars have to touch. They touch right along these lines that are in between the intervals. All right. So we got to figure out what would be the best thing, given the graph that we have, what would be the best thing to count by going up along the side? Well, this one's set up nicely. We want to start with 0 at the bottom and then go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So 1 to 5. 1 to 5 was 7. So I'm going to make my bar here going all the way up to 7. I'm going to go straight across at 7 and straight down like that. 6 to 10 is 8. So I don't need to make another line here. I can just use this line. I'm going to go up to 8 and then go all the way down. 11 to 15, there's 4 of them. 16 to 20, there's none. So I'm just going to leave that gap right there. And then 21 to 25, there is only 1 of them. So you really should color in your bars. All right. You really should color in your bars. Later on in the chapter, we're going to be doing like double bar graphs and things like that. But for right now, you can just color them in like this. And I should also mention at this point, sometimes you won't just have whole numbers. Sometimes you'll have halves. For example, if maybe this last one, depending on what the data was, maybe we had 1.5. Well, then you would go halfway up because you would have to go in between 1 and 2. But in this one, we don't have that, so we're not going to worry about it. So that is a histogram. A histogram is a bar graph. Our bars touch, all right? They have to start right at the beginning. We have to go through and do our tallies in our frequency table as well. So now you're going to have questions about the bar graph. How many had 10 or fewer grams of sugar? 10 or fewer grams. So 10 or fewer, we have all the way up to 10 here. So 10 or fewer would be all of these two. All right, 10 or fewer would be these two. So that means we have 7 plus 8. So we have 15 different cereals that had 10 or fewer. How many had 16 or more? 16 or more. 16 is here or more. So we're looking at these two. That is 0 plus 1, which is 1. Or you could look at the bar graph, histogram. 16 or more would be right there. We only have 1 of them. Now, this last question is a little bit weird. It depends on what they're having you look at. Sometimes they will be very specific. How many have exactly 5 grams of sugar? Now, from the data, we can look and see exactly how many. All right, we can look at the data and figure out how many right from the data. If I go through my data and I can look back at my data, I see a 5 here, I see a 5 here, and that's it. So I know that there's 2 boxes of cereal that have exactly 5. I can tell that from the actual raw data. Now, if they said looking at the histogram or looking at the graph, how many had 5? Well, if you're not given the data, all right, and you were just given this data here in the table or just given the graph, can I tell exactly how many had 5? I can't because these are grouped as 1 to 5. So these 7 little tallies, these could all be 3s. They could all be 2s. You could have a 1, a 1, a 1, a 1, a 1, a 1, and a 5. I have no idea if I'm just given the table or if I'm just given the graph. I can't pinpoint the exact number. So if they said just looking at the graph or didn't give you the raw data, you could not determine. You couldn't determine how many that you had. So this section is pretty easy. Again, all that you're doing is building histograms or bar graphs. Again, use all one color. All right. Make sure that your bars are touching. Make sure that they start right at the beginning. All right. The intervals. Make sure that you are consistent with your intervals. Fill out your tallies as you go along. I would strongly suggest crossing them out as you go. Also, with your dot plot, make sure that your X's are all the same size. Now, there is one other thing that I want to just briefly touch on because there is one homework question like this. Sometimes you'll be given data that looks like this in a data table, and this is super important. So if we are given data that looks like this, if you had a 20 in your data, well, which interval or which bin does it belong to? Well, this 20 right here, this is really 10 to 19.999999999 or 19.9 repeating. If this one doesn't include the 20. This one doesn't include the 20. This one does include the 20. All right. So when it says 10 to 20, that doesn't include that 20. When it says 20 to 30, this one does include the 20. Now, other ones like we did here, you don't have to worry about it because you don't have that repeat number. But sometimes they will do ones that look like this where they repeat numbers. That's because they're looking for decimals and things like that. They didn't want to put here 20.0000. They didn't want to put 19.9 repeating here. All right. Yes, it would be probably easier and less confusing, but that's not how they do it. So anytime that you have an interval like this, it goes with the where they repeat a number, it goes with the bigger one. All right. So it goes with the bigger interval here where we start with that number. That number includes it. This one does not.